Hi everyone, thanks for joining in today. I'm excited to have Liza Nash Taylor join me. Just a little bit about Liza. So Liza was a 2018 Hawthornden International Fellow and received an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts the same year. She is the 2016 winner of the San Miguel Writers Conference Fiction Prize, and her work has appeared in Gargoyle magazine, Deep South, and others. Her debut historical novel, Etiquette for Runways, I think, can we see that behind you? Yep. Released in August 2020 from Blackstone Publishing, and In All Good Faith is a standalone sequel which was released in August 21, which is also from Blackstone, and earned a Booklist starred review. A native Virginian, Liza lives in Keswick with her husband and dogs in an old farmhouse which serves as a setting for her novels. A former designer for Ralph Lauren, Liza also lectures in fashion history. So thanks so much for joining us. Just wondering if you want to start off by telling us a little bit about your books.
Sure, Jackie, thank you so much for having me. I was just saying before we went live, this is my first international interview, which is kind of exciting.
Exciting.
Yeah, so In All Good Faith, here, is my second novel. I had my debut came out in 2020, the second one a year later. And the first one is set in the 1920s, starting at the house where I'm sitting in Keswick, Virginia. I was wondering if you were going to say Keswick, as the Brits do, or Keswick, because there is actually a Keswick, England.
Did I say it properly?
Well, for Americans, you did, yes.
Okay, that's good.
So the first book, Etiquette for Runaways, leaves the main character, Mae Marshall, in 1926 in Paris, having made a spectacular mess of her life. And In All Good Faith picks up in 1932. 6 years later, she's back at home in Virginia, where she grew up, again, at the house where I'm sitting right now. And it's the Great Depression is happening in the United States. So I had an idea when I started the book of what was going to, what the next chapters of her life were going to be. And so it started out being a sequel. And this other character kept sort of popping into my head. And I'd never had that happen before. I've heard other authors talk about it, but it had never happened to me. So finally, as I was doing research on this era, on the Great Depression and the events of the Depression, I kept coming across research that I thought was compelling and interesting, but it led me away from Virginia, away from Mae's story. So I started listening to this character who was a 16-year-old girl from Boston, and I knew she had had a hard life. Anyway, once I started sort of listening to her and things I had researched started clicking into place, I realized that this story had to be a dual narrative. And so I told the story alternately, continuing Mae's story from before, and this other character, Dorrit Sykes, telling her story until they meet about halfway through, and then their lives intersect and affect each other. So the plot is centered, it revolves around the events of an event in the United States in 1932 called the Veterans Bonus March. And that was, of course, America was, so many Americans then were destitute, losing their farms and their homes and their jobs. And a group of 8 veterans from World War I took off from Oregon in May of 1932. And their intention was to cross the United States by riding the rails or hitchhiking or walking to meet with President Herbert Hoover and ask him to pay their war bonuses early. These were certificates that were given at the end of World War I to the soldiers. And they were slated to be paid in 1945 with interest, almost like a bond. And so as these 8 started across the country, they started getting a lot of press and a lot of attention. And by the time they got to Washington, there were 1,000. A few weeks later, there were 14,000. And by June, there were 20,000 United States veterans camping around Washington, D.C., around the Capitol, in demolished office buildings and along the rivers there around the Capitol. And of course, you can imagine it was unsanitary. There wasn't enough food. And at the end of July, President Hoover, who refused to meet with these veterans, sent General Douglas MacArthur in one night in July 28th with tear gas and tanks to burn all of these marchers out. And so it's something of a smudge on our history here. I didn't hear about it in history class in school. So my plot imagines taking a 16-year-old girl who has anxiety issues and plonking her down in the middle of this incredible situation on her own. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, that's what it's about.
Yeah. I've read An Old Good Faith and really loved the history and that behind it. It was really great.
Thank you.
And I did learn things that I didn't know about before, which was great as well. I'm just wondering, like you said about the tanks coming in, and is that something you only found out when you were researching for this book, or had you found
Yes.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
So that would have been a bit of a surprise to you then.
It really was. And a lot of people I've talked to or who have read the book didn't know about this event. And Washington, I'm about 2.5 hours away from Washington, where I am right now. But we really didn't hear much about it. But when you start looking, it's all there. It's all documented. They called, these encampments were called Hoovervilles, and that came to be known as a homeless encampment term all over the country. It was really, Hoover didn't handle it well at all. But once I found out about that, I knew immediately where this teenage girl character from Boston fit in to the plot. And then from there, it was not difficult to connect her being in Washington, D.C. and getting her to Keswick, Virginia, so that the two characters could meet.
Yeah. And you said that where you live now is featured in the book. Is the history of your house something you were aware of, or something you were able to find out about?
That's a good question. The house is built, we bought the house about 25 years ago, and it was just a ramshackle farmhouse in terrible condition. I mean, you couldn't make coffee and run the toaster at the same time, or fuses would blow up. So I never knew much of the history. But one day, about 10 years ago, a woman drove up our driveway, knocked on the door, and told us that her father had grown up in this house. And she took us upstairs, and she showed us in one of the fireplace hearths in the cement these tiny little footprints. And she said, those were my father's footprints when he was 3 years old.
Wow.
And then she left, and then she sent us some photos, and I actually have one of them here. I'm going to show you. This is her father when he lived here, and his dog. And that this photo inspired a character in my book, Hank, and his dog. And
he
then
looks like a very happy boy.
Yes.
And the dog looks beautiful as well.
Yes. We have plenty of dogs here at Keswick Farm now. But I don't know a lot. I don't really follow any of the history of the house, but it inspires me. It certainly does. I love old places and old things. And obviously that's a big reason why I like to write historical fiction.
Yeah. And you've obviously led a very interesting life before, like being a designer. And what made you want to write a book? And is it something that you'd always thought you were going to do?
No, not at all. My first career was in fashion, and I've always been a voracious reader. And especially as a child, I read sort of children's classics like The Secret Garden and A Little Princess. Those were the books that appealed to me. I think I had a secret yearning to be an abandoned English orphan. And then moving, into my teens, that I started loving Jane Eyre and those sorts of books. Then when my daughter went to high school, when I was 53, I started taking literature classes. You were just then beginning to be able to take classes online. So I decided I would go and get a second degree in English. So I loved these classes. And as I worked toward this degree, one of the options for a class was a fiction writing course. And I took it and started. The instructor said, you need to start writing a novel. And I was like, well, okay. So I found I just loved playing with the words, combining the words into sentences, and what other word could you use? It was like a puzzle. So anyway, that was, I don't know, how long ago was that? Like 8 years ago. So I got a few short stories published, and pretty quickly I decided that if I was going to go anywhere with this, I needed to learn a lot more about how to write. So I applied to an MFA program that I started when I was 56. And through that program, I refined and revised my first novel, Etiquette for Runaways. And I got an agent during that time. And then that book was my master's thesis. And then while that was out to publishers, looking for a buyer, I finished In All Good Faith. Because while I was in my master's program, every month you have to turn in 30 new pages. So I had to start a new project. So I started this sequel. I thought, that's the easiest thing. I already know the characters, right? I'll just continue the story. So that was how I came to start a sequel.
And you must have done a lot of research for both of your books. Is there anything in your research that you found that you thought, that will make a good book for later on?
Oh, nobody's ever asked me that. That's no, I really haven't had that happen. But however, with both of my books, I found I had an idea starting out. I don't write from a strict outline, but I had an idea of where the story would go, and that there would be 3 parts or whatever. And then as I go along, I love doing the research, but you have to narrow down how far you're going to go in research. For instance, in my first book, one of the characters is inspired by Josephine Baker. So I read all of these biographies of Josephine Baker. She was actually going to be a character. And my then literary agent said, no, don't make her a character, because then readers will have expectations. You'll have to follow the timeline of her life, and it'll confine you. And I was like, God, I read all these biographies. and anyway, it ended up being the smartest thing to create a character that was inspired by her. So as I go along, I have an idea where the plot is going, what the trajectory of the arc is of the character, but I don't know the ending. And in both cases, it's very much been informed by research. These twists in the plot come about through actual events that I find in research.
And are you able to tell us anything about what you're working on at the moment?
Sure. Yes, I am. I don't know where I am. If I could say I'm 3/4 of the way through, I don't know, of a third manuscript. It's also historical, set in 1952, and the plot revolves around events in the life of the French fashion designer Jacques Fat. He died at the age of 42 of leukemia at the height of his career. It was pretty much Christian Dior, Jacques Fat, and Balenciaga were the triumvirate of great couturiers at that time. So my story imagines a sort of naive American girl going over by happenstance being hired as a fit model, and then sort of going through the odyssey of the discovery that he's ill, and how he and his wife handled that. So it's been fun to research that era, because to see the fashion and the old, I always buy old magazines of the period and read them. I've just got a big stack of Life magazines from 1952. And it's so fun to go through them and see all the details of everyday life.
And could you tell us what you like reading yourself, and maybe if there is something you've read lately you could recommend to us?
Yes, let me think. I really like the classics, and I like books like early 20th century. I'm a big fan of Truman Capote is one of my favorites. Modern authors, I love Donna Tartt. I'm just finishing Ann Patchett's very recently released book of essays called These Precious Days, and it's very timely. She wrote it during the first quarantine, and that's been wonderful, because she writes about things like choosing her book covers and going on a book tour, and so there's a lot of interesting things for authors in that. And I love audiobooks. I'm a huge fan of, I'm always listening to something. And I have something like 300 audiobooks in my library. So I've started back at the beginning, and I just listened to The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton, which was wonderful. And another, like my number one audiobook is Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, read by Colin Firth. Which is just like a good, really wonderful. Yeah.
And are your books on audio?
They are, yes. Sophie Amos recorded the most recent one, and I think she did a very good job. She had to do a Southern accent and a Boston accent, which, don't tell anyone from Boston. Boston accent could be a little irritating to listen to. So she did a really good job of sort of soft pedaling that and not making it, really grating. No, she did a great job. And it's really interesting being an audiobook fan, as I am, to be able to talk to the person who's going to read your book. And say, the town of Stanton, Staunton, we say Stanton. It looks like Staunton. And things like that. And to be able to go through a list of things like that with her.
That's good, because I have to say, as a listener, sometimes if someone says something wrong or their accent's really, really bad, it can really put you off the book as well. So that's good. You had that involvement.
You are exactly right. Yes, and a really cheesy Southern accent to me is just unbearable. Because if it really sounds sort of, and you must have the same feeling about a bad Australian accent, right?
Well, I'm actually I'm from New Zealand originally, and I have heard some really, really bad New Zealand accents and some,
Yeah, so that was fun to be able to talk to her about and I would say, read it as if you were telling me a story. I don't overly dramatize, don't over enunciate. That drives me crazy too, when narrators really over enunciate and are overly dramatic in reading. I mean, I know that they bring their own talent, their own acting talent to the reading, which is fantastic. It's just a question of connecting. And luckily in my contract, I got to have input.
That's great.
On the narrators.
Because I don't know if all authors do, so that's great. And we've got a question from Kelly, who's watching. Kelly wonders, what has been your favorite part of being an author? Great question, Kelly.
Oh, that is a good question. Well, there's a lot of validation in, to me, the crystallizing moment of validation was going on Amazon and typing in the title of my first book and having a page on Amazon. It was like, wow, I did that. So that's been nice because, you know, as much as authors work and write and try to get agents or get published, a lot of them just don't get that far. So I feel really fortunate. But my favorite part, my least favorite part has been in general doing author events, just because I have always had stage fright. But the funny thing is doing so many of them and doing them in quarantine, sitting in my living room, I've managed to work through that.
Yeah.
So now I actually enjoy them. So that's been a big change for me.
And it's great for readers as well, that we can connect to so many people from different parts of the world.
Definitely.
And could you tell us what your least favourite part has been of your publishing journey?
Ooh, the waiting. The waiting. I started with one agent with my first manuscript, and she took me on in a revise and resubmit status, which meant that she liked my manuscript, but she knew it needed work. And she was going to work with me to make it better. And if I could get it to a point that she really believed in it, she would sign me. And she did. And then we continued working together, and we realized that our vision for this character and my book were going in different directions. And I take a lot of responsibility for that. At the time I was getting my master's degree, my writing was evolving. I was happy about it. I was getting away from being the author that she was first interested in. So we just could not move forward together. So then I had to wait almost a year before I was signed again and sort of start over. But luckily for me, that first manuscript had not been sent out to any publishers. So I was free to find someone new to represent it. And then there's a lot of waiting and a lot of anxiety around trying to get an agent to believe in your manuscript and you and represent you. So I went through that twice. And then that, like 2.0, is when your agent then sends your manuscript out to publishing editors, and you have that horrible waiting to see if anyone wants to buy it. And, you know, some agents will say, send it to the big 5 publishers and then say, nobody's snapped, the market has spoken, buy, good luck with the rest of your life. My agent was persistent. He at one point, while the first book was out on submission, I was finishing my MFA, so I was finishing my second novel. So at one point I said, here's the second one. Don't forget about me. I still want to take this one instead. And he said, no, calm down. I still believe something good is going to happen with the first book. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, he got a call from a publisher with an offer. And he told the publisher, well, by the way, she's just finished a standalone sequel. And they said, send it over. So I was really lucky. I got a 2-book deal. So that's, it's a lot of waiting. It's like a roller coaster. It's like, just wait and tons of anxiety. But then when something good happens, it's worth the wait, obviously.
Yeah. And Kelly has another good question. She's wondering if COVID has seen you writing more or less.
Wow, another great question. Well, it's funny because I had started this third manuscript, and I found that in promoting the first book, which came out in August of 2020, during quarantine, everything live was canceled, that I really needed to keep my head in that story so that I could talk about it intelligently and remember the characters and the storyline and really project that story. And then once that sort of died down, that first launch, all those events, we started prepping to push the second book. And I sort of dabbled with this new idea, but I couldn't really sink I couldn't really absorb it and really be deep down into it to really make it move forward. And then again, went through the second thing with the second book of launching that, doing events, keeping my head focused in that story. And so it's really only recently, in January, I really started buckling down and closing myself in a room and getting back into this third story and really investing myself and putting my other characters like literally on a shelf and saying, this is where we have to, this is moving forward.
And I'm wondering if you've got any advice you could give to a new writer. Also, especially, I don't want to say an older woman because that's not right, but maybe you're offering some inspiration to women who have had a career, children are growing up, and they change direction partway through their life.
Yeah. I started my MFA at 56 and finished at 58, 62 now. And I was not the oldest person in my MFA program. So a lot of people were going back or worked full time and were going back and getting a writing degree. To someone who's starting out late as I did, I would say take classes, learn from others, learn what you can, get into a writing group. An MFA is great, but you don't have to have that. You can get into critique groups or go to a conference, and try try different forms. For me, the first publications I had were a flash fiction piece and then a short story. And then I had, so that was sort of how I got my feet wet. And then I started into a novel and I didn't look back from there. It was my thing. But I would say try different forms, try writing classes, but definitely try to learn what you can, because it is quite fascinating. I'm always learning. I'm still reading books about techniques and how different writers manage different effects.
And you said about a writers group, like, have you found a supportive writers group yourself?
Well, when I was in my MFA program, my cohort, we would have workshops together and exchange work. So that was really my core for a while. And then I had a local group of about 7 writers, and one of the members died, sadly, and we sort of fell apart for a while. And then with quarantine, we sort of just didn't get back to, we haven't pulled back together. But I miss that very much. I would love to find a new group of peers to give me some really constructive criticism on what I'm working on now.
Yeah, because do you find that you like to share what you're working on as you go along with a few people to get feedback, or do you wait usually till later?
It's funny because I talk to authors who say, oh, my husband reads everything and he's my first critic, or my wife, or whatever. And I think, really? Wow. What I write is not what my husband's a voracious reader, but he likes Tom Clancy and thrillers and spy books and exploding submarines and stuff. And he read my short stories once they were published, and he did not read my novels until they were actually out. And it got a little embarrassing because we'd be going to cocktail parties and people would say, Rocky, tell me about Liza's book. What's it? And so he got this little spiel that was kind of very topical, but he clearly hadn't read it. So anyway, they say I've heard many times, your loved ones are not your best critics. They should not be, because they're all going to say, this is great. You're really onto something. So it's better to have people that you don't have to necessarily even like them, but they they get your vibe and they can give you something really constructive.
And Kelly wonders, out of all your characters you've had so far, do you have one that's the most memorable?
Ooh. Well, Mae Marshall has appeared in both books, and I feel like I've I've seen her grow up, starting from 19 in Etiquette for Runaways to 26, 27 in All Good Faith. So I'm very fond of her. But this character, Dorrit Sykes from In All Good Faith, the 16-year-old from Boston, she has had lifelong anxiety issues. And that came from me. That is something I've had in panic attacks for as long as I can remember. So that was very personal, turning that and putting that into a character. And so because of that, I think she really has a chunk of my heart, you know, written into her.
Yeah. And do you find that maybe a little bit healing or something, writing about something that's so personal to you?
Yes, you know, you're right. I didn't know that it would be, but when you take an experience and you turn it into words, and you can rearrange them and reorder them, and you can adjust the pace at which the story is told, then you take control over it. And to me, that's empowering. I had a story published about one of my dogs being attacked by another dog. It was pretty traumatic. The dog survived, but I wrote an essay about it, and that was really a healing experience. To write it down, and as I said, to be able to shift it around and take control of it that way.
And Kelly wonders if writing's become easier after you've been published, or do you find the expectations are higher?
In some ways, it's not easier. It's more familiar. I know how I work. I know how I organize my research, for instance. I know to start an author's note with the credits sort of from the beginning, and I know how I like to divide up my work into parts or chapters and things like that. So that has been more comfortable, and I'm making peace with the fact that I don't always know my endings when I start out, which caused me anxiety the first couple of times. So yeah, it's it doesn't get easier. It's just you sort of, I think, come to trust a little bit your own process a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for chatting to me. It's been great.
Thank you for having me.
Just wondering if you want to let people know how they can keep in touch with you.
Yeah, sure. I'm not on Twitter. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Liza Nash Taylor. And the books are available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Book Depository internationally, which I've never used, but it's great. I sent copies to a friend in Paris. And to buy the book from them was exactly the same as shipping it myself here, from here. So I think that's a great service. Yeah, I'd love to hear further questions or follow me on Instagram. Love that. And thank you, Jackie, so much. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you.
No, thank you. And thanks for the questions from people who joined in. Thanks.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.